Very pleased to welcome Raphael, who is the coordinator for the archiving project of the Network of Religious Communities. Welcome.
Thank you.
Good to have you here. You know, it was way back in the early 2000s that we were cleaning the attic of the Network of Religious Communities, and we came across files with just some amazing history. And when we showed it to historians, they said, "Oh, this is remarkable. This is really going to change history for this area, that there are just so many amazing things that were found." Well, by the almost 10 years later, the Network of Religious Communities established an archiving project, and Robin was hired as coordinator.
It has been such a fascinating experience to be involved in this. I'm coming from a background without any experience in archiving. I'm not a historian. I'm not even a native of Buffalo. But we got a small team of people together beginning in, I think, February of 2015, and we sought to organize all of the papers of the network from basement to attic. And over the course of working on Wednesday mornings for a period of several years, we actually created an inventory of over 200 boxes of papers. And we thought that that was the end of it, that everyone in all of the History Museum, etc., would be interested in this fascinating information, but everyone is taxed. And so we decided we would keep going. We've been able to get some grants, as you know, and we've been able to continue to organize the files and begin to digitize them. And that's been the most exciting part, is that we now have over 16 books of minutes and directories that are on a site called New York Heritage. We're part of a network of library systems throughout New York State. Ours is called the Western New York Library Resource Council. We've worked very closely with our contact person, Heidi Ziemer, who has been such a help in helping us keep going with this project.
Well, maybe you could share some of the gems, or at least some of the things that are really interesting that one did not always expect to find.
So the first thing, we knew that the history went back to 1857, and yet it took a long time to find papers that went back that far. And finally, I discovered like a listing of where things might be. And so I looked in the safe and found the oldest set of minutes from the Erie County Sunday School movement. And as I was just casually leafing through it, my eye caught this one letter that was written October 12th, 1863, from Rappahannock, Virginia. And he starts, "My dear brother, your favor of the 19th of September was received in due time. I need not say I was glad to hear from you, and to thus be reminded of one with whom I in former days have had very many pleasant intercourse, cooperation, and sympathy as a Sunday school worker in dear old Erie." And then he continues to talk about how wonderful the Sabbath school movement is and the quality of the work that they've been doing, and his efforts as a chaplain in this unit to try and have Bible study classes, etc., and why at times this is a challenge. But these precious privileges were interrupted by the advance of the army about the middle of September to the Rappahannock. He then continues, "We are apparently on the eve of a severe and fearful encounter with the enemy, whereby many precious lives in all probability will be sacrificed." It gave me chills when I first read that. It was just such an exciting, unexpected find.
Well, the original documents we found were from the Buffalo Women's Club, and we weren't even aware that that existed.
And one of the things that I've learned over the course of time is that you have to look to see who owns the information and whether there are still groups that are vital and alive and able to process the information. But we did love that collection. It was 2 boxes of history dating back to the 1900s. And the things that I found, that even though we did find a local group of women who are still very active, and so therefore I had to give it to them, but they were involved. One of the first stories that I read was their complaints to the city about the pigs and the cattle that were roaming through the streets and creating havoc between 3 and 7 o'clock in the morning. They also complained about streetcars that had been stopping on one side and then were now stopping on the other side and creating filth and very difficult for people to walk through the mud. Interestingly, they were concerned with creating and supplying penny lunches for students in schools. They created proclamations for there to be school nurses, and they also were interested in having women probation officers. I did say to the ladies, the local ladies, that if they weren't going to process these papers, they had to give them back to us so that we would be able to do them, because it was just so wonderful.
Well, there were some amazing things you found from the 20s into the early 1930s. It
was just a delightful read. I mean, and delightful is not the right word, because there was so much going on at that time. One of the things that we discovered was that they were very concerned with interracial and the needs of the foreign-speaking community, the immigrants. And so in the early 1920s, the Council of Churches designated a report that looked at, they called it, the Foreign and Negro Speakers Report. And they analyzed, they went house to house and looked at every single person, what religion they were, what churches they belonged to. In one section, we found that there was only 50% of the people that even belonged to a church. And they were talking about the needs, the economic needs of the community. The Council of Churches, as our predecessor organization was called at that time, changed their meeting venue because the Statler Hilton had an open interracial policy, and they believed that was important. They also adopted resolutions in support of federal anti-lynching legislation in 1923. One of the very interesting local prominent figures is a man named Reverend Dr. J. Edgar Nash. And there's a lot going on right now in the Buffalo area about the Michigan area, the African American corridor. And Reverend Nash approached the Council of Churches for support back in the early 1920s, well, the early 1930s, to ask for financial assistance so that the colored ministers in the city could then provide support to their constituencies who were going through the Depression and suffering major challenges.
Yeah, and as we're doing now, looking at the pandemic, that the distribution of aid and so forth really was not reaching the African American community. And that's where the Reverend Jesse Nash challenged the Council of Churches at that point.
And I noticed later on, although I don't know exactly what role he played, but he was on, I think, the board of directors of the Council of Churches. So he did create an ongoing presence representing the colored ministers.
Well, you also found some interesting things about a World Peace Conference held here in Buffalo.
In 1924, this 9th World Peace Congress asked the Council of Churches to be the host of this initiative. And their mission back in 1924 were cuts in armaments, entrance of the United States into the World Court, and many other things. And what we found in the records was just a scrapbook filled with newspaper articles about them coming, what they talked about, who was involved in social activities, and it's just a fascinating snapshot of a period in time.
Well, we have just a little over a minute left, but I need to go back. You were telling me about one of the former executives of the Council of Churches that really got the whole community riled up and went to City Hall and got statements and so forth made.
I did?
Where he, again, against smut, against...
Oh, well, we found as we were going through the records this Fight Against Filth campaign, and it's very colorful. And we do have that in the records, and it was just, I mean, we laughed and laughed about how anachronistic something like that seems in this day and age to be fighting against smut. In the 1920s, no, I know what you're referring to. In the 1920s, one of the executives was very concerned about the vice in Erie County, and he went to the extreme of hiring detectives at times or walking the streets himself because he was concerned about ladies of the night, and he was concerned about soda shops.
Oh my gosh.
And of course he was concerned about drinking and was very in favor of prohibition.
Well, there's so much more we're discovering and want to have you back to talk about it. I want to thank you for being here, Robin Raphael, coordinator for the Network of Religious Community Archiving Project.